Welcome to the world of daily life stories. Don't forget to like and subscribe so you don't miss new stories. Enjoy listening. The arrival of change. The moment Cheryl Walker stepped out of the sleek black sedan, she paused for a moment, taking in the grandeur of the Maxwell and Company headquarters. The glass facade shimmered under the mid-morning sun, the building itself seeming to emanate power and ambition. This was the kind of place where careers were made or broken, a microcosm of corporate America where reputations were as fleeting as the quarterly numbers. Cheryl exhaled deeply, smoothing the creases of her understated beige blazer. Today is not about showing power, she reminded herself. It was about listening, watching, and understanding. After decades of navigating the turbulent waters of finance, climbing to executive heights most could only dream of, Cheryl was no stranger to corporate politics. She'd faced it all, challenges from peers, doubters who underestimated her, and systemic biases that pushed against her every achievement. But through grit, intellect, and grace, she rose above it all. And today, she was about to put that experience to work in her new role, Director of Operations for Maxwell's West Coast branch. But Cheryl had no intention of walking in with titles and fanfare. That wasn't her style. She had learned long ago that sometimes, the best way to clean house was to see the dirt for yourself, unfiltered and raw. Instead of introducing herself as the new boss, Cheryl chose a different tactic. A week of observing her new team as a temporary analyst would tell her far more than any formal report ever could. She needed to witness how the team functioned when they didn't think anyone important was watching. Under the alias Cheryl Brown, she had applied through a temp agency Maxwell often used for last-minute hiring. To the rest of the staff, she would be nothing more than another cog in the machine, a newbie trying to keep up. As Cheryl stepped through the revolving glass doors, she noticed the subtle glances from the lobby staff. There was always a hierarchy in spaces like this. The well-dressed executives walked with polished arrogance, heads held high, while others, the temps, the interns, the assistants, were like shadows, invisible and unremarkable. Today, Cheryl would blend with the shadows. A tense reception. By the time Cheryl reached the 12th floor, where her new department resided, the elevator doors opened to a world that felt different from Maxwell's prestigious New York offices. Here, the hum of productivity was muted, replaced with a tension that clung to the air like static electricity. A quick glance told Cheryl everything she needed to know. Some desks were neat and pristine, their occupants focused on monitors, fingers dancing across keyboards. Others were cluttered with coffee cups and crumpled documents, the employees slouched and half-engaged, as if they'd already given up. And then there were those whose piercing eyes followed her every step. She approached the receptionist, a young woman whose smile didn't quite reach her eyes. "Hi, I'm Cheryl Brown, the new temp analyst starting today." "Oh. The receptionist flipped through a logbook and nodded. "You'll be at desk 14. Just over there. Kevin Harper is your floor lead, he'll help get you set up." The words sounded mechanical, her gaze flickering toward a man standing near the break room. Kevin Harper. Cheryl had heard about him in whispers during the internal transfer process. Brilliant but arrogant. Charismatic but divisive. Every office has one, Cheryl thought. And he already seemed to sense easy prey. Kevin was tall, fit, and wore his tailored suit like armor. His sharp jawline and carefully styled hair gave him the look of someone who spent far too much time worrying about appearances. As Cheryl settled into her desk, she saw him saunter toward her, his smirk arriving before he did. The first encounter. "Hey, new girl," Kevin called, his voice slicing through the low hum of the office. Heads turned, some curious, others embarrassed on her behalf. "You sure you're in the right department? This floor's for analysts, not interns." Cheryl glanced up from her computer and offered a polite smile. "This is desk 14, isn't it?" Kevin blinked, unprepared for her calm demeanor. "Sure, but I'm just saying, this isn't the kind of place where newbies last long. Big deadlines. Lots of pressure. You sure you can keep up?" There it was, the carefully disguised insult. Cheryl could feel the judgment in his tone. She had seen his type before, men who used condescension as a weapon, cloaking their insecurity behind bravado. Kevin's eyes swept over her outfit, her simple pearl earrings, her natural curls framing her face. To him, she wasn't worth more than a few careless words. Cheryl met his gaze, unflinching. "I appreciate the advice. I'll try not to slow you down." Kevin laughed, a hollow sound meant to entertain his audience. Cheryl noticed a group of employees stealing glances at them. Some looked amused. Others turned back to their work, perhaps too familiar with Kevin's antics to bother intervening. "All right, don't say I didn't warn you," he said, walking off with exaggerated confidence. Cheryl's lips curled slightly into a knowing smile. Game on, Kevin, she thought. Observations in silence. For the rest of the day, Cheryl observed everything. She worked quietly at her desk, asking minimal questions, but paying attention to every interaction. Kevin spent half his time hovering near others' desks, delegating tasks that weren't his to assign. When he wasn't micromanaging, he was charming his clique, employees who laughed at his jokes and nodded at his every word, whether out of loyalty or fear, Cheryl couldn't tell. A few employees caught her attention in a different way. Across the aisle sat Gina, a soft-spoken analyst who worked tirelessly but rarely raised her head. At one point, Cheryl overheard Kevin bark at her for missing a minor formatting detail. Gina apologized profusely, though Cheryl doubted she'd made the mistake. Near the back of the room sat Marcus, a tall man with a quiet strength about him. Unlike Kevin, he seemed to command respect without trying. Whenever he spoke, people listened, and Cheryl noticed that Marcus often covered for colleagues under pressure. There's leadership potential here, Cheryl thought, watching Marcus help a coworker solve a complex problem. But the team's morale was low, their enthusiasm dampened by something deeper than just a heavy workload. Kevin's toxicity was just the tip of the iceberg. Kevin's parting shot. As the clock neared 5 p.m., Cheryl shut down her computer and began packing her bag. She had barely moved from her desk all day, yet she felt the weight of 100 observations. Kevin strolled past, still playing his part. "Good luck tomorrow, Cheryl," he said with a faux cheerful grin. "Maybe you'll figure out how the coffee machine works by then." Cheryl didn't react, though she felt the eyes of the entire office on her. The chuckles from Kevin's clique followed her as she walked toward the elevator. But Cheryl's mind was elsewhere. She thought about Gina, whose spirit seemed crushed under Kevin's constant pressure. She thought about Marcus, whose leadership qualities went unnoticed by those too distracted by office politics. And she thought about Kevin himself, a man who thrived in this broken environment, seemingly untouchable. "This place is rotting from the inside," she thought as the elevator doors closed. But not for long. Not if she had anything to do with it. Tomorrow would bring a new day. And soon, Kevin and his clique would learn the hard truth: the temp wasn't temporary at all. The pressure builds. The next morning, Cheryl stepped off the elevator promptly at 8 a.m. Unlike the day before, she didn't pause to observe the building's grandeur. Today, her focus was sharp and deliberate. She had a mission, one that would unfold quietly over the next few days. As she approached her desk, she noticed Kevin was already there, leaning against the edge of a cubicle, laughing boisterously with a few coworkers. His suit was even more tailored than yesterday, his tie a bold red that practically screamed for attention. He glanced at her as she sat down, the corners of his mouth curling into his trademark smirk. "Morning, Cheryl," he said, stressing her name like it was a punchline. "Ready to tackle some real work today, or should I grab the training wheels?" Cheryl didn't bother responding. She'd learned long ago that silence was more powerful than feeding into someone's ego. Instead, she pulled out a notebook and began reviewing her tasks for the day, tasks Kevin had conveniently offloaded onto her the afternoon prior. If he thought piling busy work on her would make her stumble, he was in for a surprise. Unseen layers began to show. As Cheryl worked, her calm efficiency began to catch people's attention. Her notes were precise. Her calculations were flawless. While the other analysts relied on pre-built templates for their spreadsheets, Cheryl built hers from scratch. The elegance of her work didn't scream for recognition, but it was impossible to miss for those who looked closely. Around mid-morning, Gina stopped by Cheryl's desk, her voice barely above a whisper. "Hey, I noticed the numbers you pulled earlier were really accurate. Did you use a formula for that?" Cheryl looked up, offering Gina a warm smile. "I did, actually. It's a custom formula I put together years ago. Do you want me to show you?" Gina hesitated, as if asking for help were a crime. "I don't want to bother you." "It's no bother," Cheryl replied gently. "Come on, pull up a chair." Gina sat down, and Cheryl spent the next 15 minutes walking her through the process. It was subtle, but Cheryl noticed how Gina's shoulders relaxed the more they talked. For the first time, the young analyst smiled, small and fleeting, but it was there. "Thanks, Cheryl. I really appreciate it." "Anytime, Gina," Cheryl said, watching as the woman returned to her desk, her confidence noticeably brighter. Kevin, however, noticed the interaction too. From across the room, he shot Cheryl a look of barely concealed annoyance, as if her mere presence was throwing off his carefully curated office dynamic. Kevin turns up the heat. As lunchtime approached, Cheryl headed for the break room, craving a cup of coffee. She wasn't there 5 seconds before Kevin walked in, his footsteps loud and purposeful. "Hey, Cheryl," he said, his tone dripping with fake politeness. "Need help finding the creamer, or are you good?" "I'm good, thanks," she replied evenly, pouring herself a cup. Kevin leaned against the counter, his smirk returning. "You know, I've got to hand it to you. You're pretty committed to this whole new girl thing. Most temps are out of here in a week, but you're really giving it your all." Cheryl stirred her coffee slowly, unbothered. "Just doing my best, Kevin. Isn't that what matters?" "Sure," Kevin said, his voice growing sharper. "But here's the thing about temp workers, they come and go, and no one really notices. The rest of us? We're the ones who actually keep this place running." Cheryl turned to face him, holding her mug with both hands. "You seem very sure of your place here." "I am." He straightened up, as if standing taller would intimidate her. "I've been here for 7 years. I know how this place works, who's valuable and who's just filling a seat." Cheryl met his gaze, her expression unreadable. "Well, I'm glad you're so confident, Kevin. It must make things much easier for you." Before he could respond, Marcus entered the break room. His presence seemed to shift the air, grounding it. "Kevin," he said with a pointed look. "HR's looking for you. Something about those reports you turned in last week." Kevin's smirk faltered for a second. Yeah, I'll take care of it." As Kevin stormed out, Marcus looked over at Cheryl. "You okay?" "Perfectly fine," she replied with a small smile. "Thank you." Marcus studied her for a moment, his sharp eyes taking in more than he let on. Finally, he nodded. "He's a lot to deal with. Don't let him get to you." "I won't," Cheryl promised. As Marcus left, Cheryl sipped her coffee, her resolve strengthening. She'd seen enough of Kevin's tactics to know he wasn't just a bully, he was a symptom of a much larger issue. If this office culture was going to change, Kevin wasn't the only problem that needed fixing. A shocking discovery. That afternoon, Cheryl uncovered something that made her pause. While reviewing a series of reports Kevin had passed to her for cleanup, she noticed inconsistencies. Numbers that didn't add up. Projections based on faulty data. Her brows furrowed as she double-checked the files. Kevin's name was all over them. For a brief moment, Cheryl debated what to do. This wasn't her job yet, technically. But she couldn't ignore it. Sloppiness like this had no place in a financial firm of Maxwell's caliber. She glanced around the office, watching Kevin laugh and chat with his clique. He was the golden boy here, protected by his confidence and charisma. No one questioned him. But Cheryl knew the truth, his success was built on smoke and mirrors. Pulling out a fresh notepad, she began documenting the errors, dates, figures, everything. If she was going to confront this problem, she needed evidence. Gina's breakdown. As the day wore on, Cheryl noticed Gina looking increasingly stressed. By late afternoon, Gina was practically trembling at her desk, staring at her screen. Like it might burst into flames. Cheryl walked over quietly. "Gina? Are you okay?" Gina looked up, her eyes glassy. "Kevin, he just sent me an email. He's blaming me for an error in his report, but I didn't." Cheryl's jaw tightened. "It's okay, Gina. Can you forward me the email?" Why?" Gina's voice wavered. "Trust me," Cheryl said softly. Cracks in the facade. The sun had barely risen when Cheryl arrived at the office the next day. Maxwell and Company's sleek lobby was eerily empty, save for the cleaning crew wrapping up their early morning duties. Cheryl enjoyed the stillness. It gave her time to think, to prepare for what was coming. The carefully collected evidence sat neatly in her bag, ready to expose the cracks in Kevin Harper's carefully polished image. By the time the clock struck 8 a.m., Cheryl was already at her desk, reviewing her notes. The office began filling with its usual crowd of employees, some alert, others bleary-eyed as they clutched their coffee cups like lifelines. Kevin started in precisely at 8:15, as if the building itself had been waiting for him to arrive. "Morning, troops," Kevin called out, his voice breaking the fragile quiet of the room. A few half-hearted greetings came in response. He paused when he noticed Cheryl already typing away, a look of surprise flickering across his face, before being quickly masked by condescension. "Wow, Cheryl. First one here? Someone's really trying to impress the boss," Kevin sneered as he walked past her desk. "Just getting an early start on my work," Cheryl said evenly, refusing to look up. Kevin chuckled, shaking his head. "Don't burn yourself out too soon, rookie. It's a marathon, not a sprint." Cheryl ignored him, her focus returning to the numbers on her screen. Little did Kevin know, his so-called rookie was running a very different race, one he wasn't even aware had begun. Unearthing the truth. Midway through the morning, Cheryl slipped away to meet with Marcus in the conference room. The quiet analyst had caught Cheryl's attention on her very first day. He was competent, hardworking, and, unlike Kevin, possessed a quiet strength that made people gravitate toward him. When Cheryl asked him to join her for a quick chat, he didn't question it. He showed up promptly, a folder of his own reports tucked under his arm. "What's this about?" Marcus asked as he took a seat. Cheryl slid a few documents across the table. "I've noticed some inconsistencies in the department's reports. Specifically, these ones." Marcus frowned as he scanned the numbers, flipping through each sheet with increasing confusion. "These projections don't add up," he muttered. "These reports were signed off by Kevin." "I know," Cheryl said. "That's the problem." Marcus looked up at her, his brows furrowed. "You're telling me Kevin's been covering up errors and pushing the blame onto others?" "Yes," Cheryl finished calmly. "I suspect Gina's not the only one who's been made the scapegoat." Marcus let out a heavy sigh and leaned back in his chair. "That explains why morale's been in the gutter. Everyone's afraid of him." Cheryl nodded. "And what about you, Marcus? You've been here long enough to see what's going on. Why haven't you said anything?" Marcus hesitated, his gaze dropping to the table. "Because no one listens. Kevin's got senior management wrapped around his finger. He delivers results, at least on paper. They don't care how he gets them." "Well, they're about to start caring," Cheryl replied firmly. "But I'll need your help." Marcus looked at her skeptically. "What can we do? You're just a temp, and I—" "Trust me," Cheryl interrupted, holding his gaze. "I may look like a temp, but I have more authority than you realize." Marcus frowned in confusion, but Cheryl didn't offer an explanation. "Not yet. For now, I just need you to trust me," she continued. I need you to help me gather the truth, real reports, emails, anything that proves what's happening. After a long pause, Marcus nodded. Okay. I'm in. Kevin loses control. By early afternoon, the tension in the office had begun to bubble over. Kevin's temper was flaring, no doubt fueled by mounting pressure from upper management. Cheryl noticed him hovering at Gina's desk again, his voice sharp and accusatory. I don't care if you thought it was fine, Gina. This is your job. How do you keep screwing up the simplest things? Gina flinched, her face pale as she struggled to defend herself. Cheryl stood up calmly, walking over to the scene unfolding in front of the entire office. Is there a problem here, Kevin? Cheryl asked, her tone light but firm. Kevin turned to face her, his eyes narrowing. Stay out of this, Cheryl. Gina's got a lot to learn, and someone's got to hold her accountable. Cheryl crossed her arms. Funny. I reviewed those reports this morning, and the mistake didn't come from Gina, it came from the data you submitted to her. A hush fell over the room. Gina's eyes widened, and Kevin froze, caught off guard. What are you talking about? He snapped, though his voice wavered. Cheryl held up a printed copy of the report. Page 3. These numbers are incorrect. I double-checked them against last quarter's records. That's not Gina's fault. Kevin's face flushed red. You're out of line, temp girl. Cheryl smiled faintly. Am I? Or are you just not used to someone calling you out? The office was silent, every eye glued to the confrontation. Kevin clenched his fists, his facade cracking. You don't know what you're talking about. Oh, I think I do, Cheryl replied smoothly. And I'm not the only one. At that moment, Marcus stood up from his desk, holding a stack of reports. These are from the last 3 months, Kevin. I've been double-checking them all day. Cheryl's right, the mistakes are yours, not the team's. Kevin whipped around to face Marcus, his expression one of pure disbelief. Are you kidding me right now? No, Marcus said firmly. I'm not. Kevin's confidence wavered, his shoulders stiffening. Cheryl watched him carefully. This was the moment his carefully constructed world began to fall apart. The reveal. As the day neared its end, Cheryl quietly packed her bag. Tomorrow would be the reckoning. She'd gathered all the evidence she needed, Kevin's errors, his treatment of the team, and his habit of shifting blame to others. Marcus and Gina had both helped her gather key documents that told the full story. But tomorrow, Cheryl wouldn't be sitting at desk 14 as Cheryl Brown, the temp analyst. Tomorrow, she would walk into this office as Cheryl Walker, Director of Operations. She smiled to herself as she rode the elevator down to the lobby. Kevin wouldn't know what hit him. A storm is brewing. Kevin, however, wasn't done. That evening, he stormed into the office of Maxwell and Company's West Coast regional manager, his supposed ally. I need to talk to you about that new temp, Cheryl Brown, he seethed. She's undermining my authority. She's spreading lies about my reports. The regional manager looked up from his laptop, his expression unreadable. We'll talk about Cheryl tomorrow, Kevin. There's a meeting first thing in the morning. Be there. Kevin blinked, thrown by the response. What meeting? You'll see. As Kevin left the office, confusion etched across his face, a growing sense of unease twisted in his stomach. He didn't realize that the very ground he'd been standing on was beginning to crumble beneath his feet. Tomorrow, everything would change. The truth unveiled. The next morning, Cheryl Walker didn't arrive at desk 14 with her usual calm demeanor and quiet presence. Instead, she walked into Maxwell and Company's 12th floor, dressed to make a statement. Her outfit, a tailored navy blue pantsuit with a crisp white blouse, exuded authority and confidence. Her hair was styled perfectly, her pearl earrings catching the light as she moved with deliberate purpose. Gone was the facade of Cheryl Brown, the temp analyst. Today, the boss had arrived. At 8 a.m. sharp, as employees settled into their desks and sipped their coffees, Cheryl strode past the rows of cubicles toward the conference room. Heads turned. Whispers rippled through the office like a wave. Some employees recognized the shift in her energy, but no one dared ask questions. Kevin Harper, still oblivious, leaned casually against a desk near his clique, laughing over some joke. He noticed Cheryl pass by but gave her little thought. He had far bigger things to worry about, like the mysterious meeting HR had arranged for him with senior management. A meeting like no other. By 8:30 a.m., the conference room was full. The department's senior leadership sat at the far end of the long glass table, with Cheryl standing near the presentation screen. Marcus, Gina, and a few other analysts sat quietly, their gazes darting between Cheryl and the door. Kevin strode in a few minutes late, his usual swagger intact, though the nervousness behind his smirk was clear. He had no idea what the meeting was about, but he was ready to spin his version of events, whatever they were. "Nice of you to join us, Kevin," Cheryl said smoothly as she gestured toward an empty seat near the center of the room. Kevin froze mid-step, turning to look at her. There was something different about her voice, an edge he hadn't noticed before. His smirk faltered as his eyes scanned the room. Why was the temp standing at the front? And why did everyone look so tense? What's going on here?" Kevin asked, trying to sound casual as he slid into the seat. Cheryl smiled faintly. "Good question. Let's get started." With a click of the remote, the presentation screen came alive with graphs, spreadsheets, and financial reports. Cheryl turned to address the room, her tone poised and measured. "Over the past week, I've spent time familiarizing myself with this team, its culture, and the quality of its work. While many employees here are talented, hardworking professionals, I've also uncovered systemic issues that demand immediate attention." The room fell silent. Cheryl clicked to the next slide, an enlarged spreadsheet. Kevin's heart skipped a beat. It was one of his reports. "This," Cheryl said, gesturing to the screen, "is an example of a Q3 report submitted to senior management last month. On the surface, it looks well put together. But when you dig deeper, you'll find multiple errors in both the data inputs and projections. These mistakes have created misleading figures that jeopardize the department's credibility." Kevin's mouth opened, then closed. He glanced nervously at the senior managers at the far end of the table, their expressions stony and unreadable. Cheryl clicked again, bringing up another set of documents. What's more troubling is that these errors were repeated across multiple reports, all originating from the same source. She turned to look directly at Kevin. "Kevin Harper." Kevin shot up from his chair, his face turning crimson. "This is ridiculous. I don't know what you're talking about. I've been handling these reports for years." Cheryl raised an eyebrow, unbothered by his outburst. "And perhaps that's the problem. Over the years, you've grown careless, and instead of taking accountability, you've shifted the blame onto your coworkers." Several employees glanced at each other, exchanging murmurs of agreement. Cheryl noticed Gina sitting quietly at the far end of the table, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, her expression unreadable. Kevin pointed a shaky finger at Cheryl. "Who even are you to say this? You're just a temp." Silence. The air seemed to freeze. Cheryl held Kevin's gaze for a long moment before responding. "I'm Cheryl Walker," she said, her voice calm but commanding. "Director of Operations for Maxwell and Company." Kevin's face went pale. His hand dropped to his side as his brain struggled to process the words. The rest of the room erupted into shocked whispers. "You're lying," Kevin muttered, though his voice lacked conviction. "No, she's not," said the regional manager, who had been sitting silently until now. He stood, addressing the group. "Ms. Walker was recently promoted to oversee operations here in the West Coast office. Over the past week, she's been evaluating this department undercover, observing the workflow, identifying strengths, and, unfortunately, exposing weaknesses." Kevin sank back into his seat, his face a mask of disbelief. You set me up." Cheryl tilted her head. No, Kevin. You set yourself up. I simply observed. Facing the consequences. For the next half hour, Cheryl laid out the evidence she had compiled over the past week, Kevin's errors, his attempts to blame others, and his toxic behavior toward the team. She highlighted specific incidents where Gina and others were unfairly targeted and showed how Marcus had quietly stepped up to clean up Kevin's mistakes without recognition. Senior leadership listened intently, their disappointment in Kevin growing more obvious with each slide. By the time Cheryl finished, the air in the room felt heavy with the weight of the truth. The regional manager turned to Kevin, his voice low and firm. Kevin, effective immediately, you are suspended pending further investigation into your conduct and performance. HR will follow up with you shortly. Kevin didn't argue. He couldn't. His confidence had been shattered, his authority stripped away. For the first time, he had no words, just silence. As he stared at the table in front of him. A new beginning. After the meeting ended, the employees filed out of the conference room one by one, their faces a mix of relief and disbelief. Cheryl remained behind, collecting her notes as Marcus approached her. That was incredible, Marcus said, shaking his head. I've never seen anyone take him down like that. Cheryl smiled warmly. It wasn't about taking him down, Marcus. It was about holding him accountable. And now, we can focus on rebuilding this team, starting with people like you. Marcus blinked. Me? You have leadership potential, Marcus. You care about this team, and you're willing to stand up for what's right. I'd like you to take on more responsibility moving forward. Marcus looked stunned but nodded, a small smile spreading across his face. I'd be honored. Cheryl turned to see Gina standing hesitantly at the door. Ms. Walker? Gina said softly. Yes, Gina? I just wanted to say, thank you. For everything. Cheryl walked over and placed a hand gently on Gina's shoulder. You don't have to thank me. Just keep believing in yourself. You're more capable than you realize. Gina smiled, a spark of confidence in her eyes for the first time. A message to the team. That afternoon, Cheryl gathered the entire department in the main conference area. Standing at the front of the room, she addressed the team as their official leader for the first time. I know this has been a challenging time for all of you, she began. But today marks a turning point. We are going to rebuild this team into something better, something stronger. We'll create a culture of respect, accountability, and collaboration. Everyone here has value, and everyone deserves to be heard. The employees exchanged hopeful glances. For the first time in years, it felt like change was not only possible, it was already happening. As Cheryl looked out at the team, she knew the hard work was just beginning. But she also knew that leadership wasn't about titles or power, it was about serving others and bringing out the best in them. And she was just getting started. A new chapter. The office buzzed with an energy Cheryl hadn't seen all week. Employees who had once worked with their heads down, burdened by fear and doubt, were now speaking to one another more freely. The toxicity Kevin Harper had injected into the team was being exhaled, and with every breath, a new sense of possibility filled the space. Change, as Cheryl knew well, didn't happen overnight, but it always began with a single step. As Cheryl settled into her new office, a corner suite overlooking the city skyline, she reflected on the whirlwind of the past few days. Though her title now made her presence official, she felt more connected to her team because of the undercover week she'd spent with them. She didn't just walk into the role as a boss, she walked in as someone who had seen the cracks up close, someone they could trust to repair them. The aftermath of Kevin's fall. The suspension of Kevin Harper had sent shockwaves through the office, but the aftermath was surprisingly calm. Most employees had known for years that Kevin's success was a house of cards, and though they hadn't spoken up out of fear, they weren't exactly mourning his departure. Did you hear he's on a leave of absence indefinitely? One analyst murmured near the break room. Couldn't have happened to a better guy, someone else replied with a hint of sarcasm. But for Cheryl, this wasn't about celebrating Kevin's downfall, it was about building something better in his absence. She had seen enough in her career to know that simply removing a toxic leader wasn't enough. If the system that enabled Kevin's behavior wasn't addressed, someone just like him would take his place. The real work had just begun. Rebuilding trust. That morning, Cheryl called for a department-wide meeting, but this one felt different. Gone were the intimidating tones and stiff lectures of the past. Cheryl stood at the front of the room, not as an overlord, but as a guide. Her voice was firm yet compassionate, the kind of leadership that encouraged people to lean in, not shrink back. "I'm not here to erase the past," Cheryl began, "but I'm here to learn from it. Over the last week, I've seen the incredible talent in this room, talent that has been held back by fear, disconnection, and mismanagement. That ends today." Eyes met hers, some still cautious, but many looking hopeful. "Change doesn't happen with one person. It happens when we work together," she continued. "I want each of you to have a voice in this team, whether it's ideas for improving processes, concerns about workload, or simply acknowledging each other's successes. Starting today, my door is open to you. All of you." Gina, sitting near the front, looked down at her hands, before quietly raising them. Cheryl smiled and nodded. "Yes, Gina? I think a lot of us stopped feeling like we mattered," Gina said softly, her voice shaking. "Kevin made us feel small, like we couldn't speak up, because it would backfire. But I want to believe it's going to be different now." "It will be different," Cheryl promised. "But it starts with trust. You trusted me this week even when you didn't know who I really was. Now it's my turn to prove that you can trust me as your leader." Cheryl's words weren't just platitudes, they were a promise. And the first step to fulfilling it was clear: empowering the people Kevin had ignored. Recognizing the right people. Later that week, Cheryl gathered Marcus and Gina in her office. The two employees had been the unsung heroes of their department for too long, their skills buried beneath Kevin's shadow. "Marcus," Cheryl said, looking at him first, "I've reviewed your work over the last few months. You've consistently gone above and beyond, often stepping up when others didn't. You have natural leadership skills, and I want to give you an opportunity to use them officially. How would you feel about becoming the new team lead for this department?" Marcus blinked in surprise. "Me? Team lead?" "Yes," Cheryl said. "You've earned it." Marcus hesitated, as if waiting for the other shoe to drop. Thank you. I'll do my best." "I know you will," Cheryl said warmly. She turned to Gina next. "And Gina, you're one of the most meticulous analysts I've seen in years. Your work speaks for itself, but I know confidence has been a challenge for you. I want to pair you with Marcus for the next 3 months. You'll lead a special project together, and I want to see your input on how we can improve team efficiency." Gina's eyes widened. "Me? Led something?" "Absolutely. You're more than ready for this," Cheryl said. Tears welled in Gina's eyes, but she nodded, her voice quiet. "Thank you, Ms. Walker. I won't let you down." "I know you won't," Cheryl said, leaning forward. "This office is full of talent, it's just been overshadowed. It's time to let it shine." Shifting the culture. Over the next few weeks, change became more than just a concept, it became a reality. Cheryl implemented open forums where employees could bring forward ideas and concerns. Weekly team recognition sessions ensured that hard work was acknowledged publicly. For the first time in years, people felt seen and valued. Gina flourished under Marcus's leadership, her confidence growing with every successful project. She began mentoring junior analysts, sharing the skills Cheryl had quietly passed on to her that first day. Marcus, meanwhile, proved to be a natural leader, balancing accountability with encouragement in a way that resonated deeply with his peers. As for Kevin Harper? HR's investigation concluded that his misconduct had been systemic and damaging. Kevin never returned to Maxwell and Company. His departure, once unthinkable, felt like the closing of an era, one that no one missed. The legacy of leadership. 6 months later, Cheryl stood once again in the same conference room where she had revealed her identity. But this time, the atmosphere was completely different. Laughter and camaraderie filled the space as employees celebrated their best quarterly performance in years. "Team," Cheryl said, raising a glass of sparkling water, "I want to toast to all of you. This success belongs to every person in this room. When I came here, I knew this team had potential, but you've surpassed even my expectations. You've proven that when we work together and respect each other, there's nothing we can't achieve." Cheers erupted as glasses clinked and congratulations were exchanged. As Cheryl looked around the room, she saw something she hadn't seen before: unity. Where there had once been fear, there was now trust. Where there had once been resentment, there was collaboration. Walking forward. That evening, as Cheryl packed up her office, she paused to look out the window at the city below. The lights sparkled like stars, a reminder that the world was full of opportunities to make a difference. Her phone buzzed with a message from Marcus: "Thanks for believing in us. You've changed everything." Cheryl smiled softly. Change wasn't easy, and it didn't happen overnight. But it was worth it. Sometimes, all it took was one person brave enough to see the truth and take a stand. Cheryl Walker had been that person. And because of her, Maxwell and Company had turned a toxic environment into a thriving team. As she walked out of the office that night, her heels clicking softly on the marble floor, Cheryl knew this was only the beginning. Her legacy wasn't about the position she held, it was about the people she'd empowered. And in the end, that was the greatest success of all.